Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. In today's lesson, we're going to be continuing work on our web application, incorporating what we learned in our last lesson about variable scope. In today's lesson, we're going to go over a new version of the web application, which is going to be version 11.0. And as a part of that, we're going to be adding four new functions to our function libraries. The first one is called process get var, which is used to process get variables. We're going to have an email comments function in which we're going to extract the part of our contactus.php script that does the emailing of the comments. We're going to add a function that's going to be used to output item links, and that's going to be used in viewcart.php. And then we're also going to create a function called calc cart total, which is going to be used to calculate our shopping cart total. In version 11.0, as mentioned, we're going to be adding these four new functions. And what they're going to do is they're going to promote us reusing code as well as aiding in the separation of our PHP and HTML, which, as we began talking about user-defined functions, is an important feature of your web application. These are the files that we're going to be editing down here. If you'll note, we're going to be editing both outputlib.php and utillib.php, which are function libraries. And then the other pages that we're going to be editing make use of these new functions that we create, except for config.php, which the only reason it's listed here is because we're updating the version number for that file. So the first function that we're going to be creating for this version of the web application is called process get var. And it's going to be in utillib.php, and it's basically a utility function that puts common code used on all of our pages that use get variables into a function so that we can reuse it in multiple spots. The three pages that we have that use get variables are checkout.php, contactus.php, and item.php. And what this function is going to demonstrate from our last lesson is the use of superglobals within local function scope. And as we learned before, there's basically two scopes in PHP. There's global scope and local function scope. So let's take a look at using this new function. First off, if we go, for example, and look at, this is version 10.0 of checkout.php. And what we can see here at the beginning is where we process all of our get variables. Here we have action and cart items. There's also customer data and order total. And if we look, we can see that basically the same code is being reused over and over. We're using a ternary operator to decide whether to set action equal to a variable specified or null, which depends on whether the get variable was set or not. And as you can see between this line here, the one for cart items, the one for customer data and order total, the only difference in the code is actually what's the variable name that's included within the get square brackets for the get array. So what we can do is actually sort of parameterize that and create a function that basically is just going to accept the name of the get variable that we want to process, and it's going to perform the same action. So if we go and look at utillib.php, down at the bottom there's a function, the function process get var is created. And basically what it does, as you can see here, is a simple one-line function. And what it does is the same operation that we saw on the last page. Move it up a little bit. In that it tests if, well, first of all, it accepts one parameter, variable name, which is the name of the get parameter that we want to process. And then what we do is we test to see if that variable was set in the get function, in the get superglobal. And if it is, we return the value of that get variable, and if not, we return the value of null. So we're basically performing the same operation, but we're doing it within one function. And as you'll notice, we're accessing the get superglobal variable, and so this is an example of accessing superglobals within your local function scope. And as you can see here in the description that I've given of how the function works, along with parameters and return values, I also typically like to include a section that mentions any global dependencies. And so here I just mentioned that this function depends on the global or global variable, or in this case superglobal variable, the underscore get. So if we go back and look, this is checkout.php from version 10.0. And if we look at version 11.0, we can see that all of those ternary operations were replaced with a call to the process get var function, and we've specified as the argument to that function the name of the get variable which we want to process. So this is going to perform the same action. It's going to test if action exists. If it does, it's going to set the variable of this short version of our get variable action to the value that was provided or input to the page. If not, it's going to set it equal to null. And as you can see, we've reused the same function down here in all these other spots. And so it's actually kind of cleaned up our code a little bit in that one, it looks a little neater in that we have a simple function call versus a long ternary operator. But also, again, the advantage of doing this and using it in a function is that we get code reuse. Whereas before, we had four different variables that we use a ternary operator to set the value of. That's 4 chances where we could make mistakes in writing that ternary operation. Here, the only mistake we can make is, because we're using the function, is essentially mistyping the name of the function's argument. In the other spots, if we look back at utilib, we could mess up putting the name of the variable here or the name of the variable here. So we're kind of reducing that at the same time that we're cleaning up our code. So the next function that we're going to create for this version of the web application is called email comments. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to remove from contact.php our large section of PHP code that we use to process the information that was input from the contact us form in order to send out an email. The function is going to be defined in utilib.php, and what it's going to do is demonstrate the use of constants. In this case, we're going to be using the email constants, which we had defined previously in config.php, and it's going to show how to use constants within local function scope. So let's take a look at the old version of contactus.php. This is version 10.0, and if we scroll down the page into the final HTML output section, which we reach, as if you remember, is when the action provided to this form is equal to contact us. And you can see here that we create short variable names for the information provided via contact info, which is a get variable. And if we go back and look at the top, you can see that in this contact info is set up here at the beginning of the page. Contact info, we set it up as a short variable for the get variable contact info. So these are again shorter variables that we're going to use below in creating the email. We can see here's where we build up the email message, we create the email header, and here's where we send out the message, the email message, and then we output a message to the user whether the email sending was successful or not. What we can do is we can actually extract all of this code in this section here, this PHP code, extract it out into a function and replace it with a single function call that's going to perform the same functionality. So if we look at contactus.php version 11, and we scroll down to that same section in the code, now that whole section of code that was related to sending the email has been updated to one line. That's the function call to email comments, and what it does is it passes this get variable contact info to the function so that it can go ahead and build up the email and then send it out. Now email comments is going to return a Boolean value indicating whether the email was successfully sent or not, and we can use that value just as before to output whether we're going to output a message that says thank you for your comments or there was an error in sending us your comments. One thing to note too is that in version 11.0, at the beginning here, we've also made use of our process get var function for this page as well, for both the contact info and action get variables. So if we go and look at utilib.php and we go to the email comments function, which is listed here, you can basically see the same code that we had in the contact us page is now moved into this function, we're creating short variables for the contact information data, which is useful in building up the email message. Here's a section where we build up the email message that we're going to send. Here we create the email header, and then as before, we're going to call the mail function, invoke the mail function provided by PHP using our two constants that we defined in config.php. So this is an example of using constants which have global scope, using them within local function scope. And as you'll notice, we haven't had to declare them with the global keyword or use the global's super global array, and that's because that's how constants work as far as scope is concerned. So we send out the mail message, we send out the email using the mail function just as before, and what we do is we suppress the error, and because if an error occurs, it's going to return false, and we simply return the return value of mail, which is going to be true or false depending on whether the mail was able to be successfully sent to the outgoing mail server. And again, just a reminder from when we talked about the mail function before, just because the mail function in PHP returns true, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the message is going to be delivered, but it does let you know that it was successfully passed along to the outgoing mail server, and that's as far as that function works. So the next function that we're going to create is called output item link. And this is something that's used in the viewcart.php page to output links to each of the different items pages, basically their product information pages. And what we're going to use this function for is to take common code that's included in viewcart.php, move it out into a function, and to make our code look a little bit cleaner. So if we go and look at viewcart, this is version 11.0, we can see here that we have a link, and this is what is our output item link function is going to output. It's going to output this image, the small image of our file, which of our item, which is a link to the item page. If we click on it, it goes to the item page. We also are going to be creating this text link that is the name of the item, and then when you click on that, it goes to the item page. And as you can see here, we have 3 different items, and so this is a common function that's being performed. We're outputting a link that contains an image and a name of the item, and here we do it 3 different times, so we're going to put that in a function and make use of it. So if we go and look at our previous version of viewcart.php, and we scroll down the page, we can see here that we have, as before, we have sections where we list the different items information. For example, we list item 1001's info, item 1002 info, and so forth. And we have the 3 different columns of our table. One is the link to the item page, one is the price, and one is the quantity. Well, here is the code that we had before in order to output the item link. We defined an item ID variable. We loaded the item from the catalog, created some short names to use in outputting our link, and then here's the section where we output the link to, move it around, where we output our link to the items page. One is a link that includes an image tag, so the image becomes a link, and then we also have a span here that includes a text link that has the name of the item. And the reason we've included them as separate links is just for formatting purposes. But what you can see is if we look down at, for example, the row for item 2002, you can see essentially this is exactly the same code as before, except the only difference is that current item ID is equal to 1002. So anytime we have the same code that we're using over and over again, we want to take advantage of being able to put it in one spot and therefore only have to change it in one spot, so we're going to put it into a function. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function called output item link .php, and this is going to be in the output lib.php function library. And the reason for that, again, is that we put all of our functions that output HTML into the same function library, and for this web application, it's output lib.php. So here we can see the new function that we've created, output item link. It takes one variable name, it takes one function parameter, which is the item ID of the item that we want to look up and output the link for. And what you can see here is basically it's the same code that we had, a little bit slightly modified, that we had within the actual view cart page. But as mentioned, we use this code 3 times, so we're going to go ahead and put it in a function so we can just call the function 3 times as opposed to actually having to write this code 3 times within our file. Not only is it going to increase the maintainability because we have less chances for mistakes, but also it's going to actually, as we'll see, make our code look a little bit cleaner by getting rid of PHP code contained within an HTML file. One important thing to notice is that this function makes use of the globals superglobal array, and it does that in order to load the item catalog, which, if you remember, is contained in our catalog.php file. It's a global variable, and so in order to access global variables within local function scope, and this is a function, we need to either use the global keyword or access them via the globals superglobal. And here that's what we've chosen to do. We could have also done it with the global keyword as well. And so this function demonstrates using global variables within local function scope. It also down here demonstrates again using constants within local function scope. And here you can see we're using the image_dir constant when we output our image tag. And again, constants have global scope and they don't need to be prefaced with the global keyword when being used within the function. So basically this is the same code that we had within the file, but we've included it in a function. Now if we go and look at ViewCart 11.0 and we go down and look at our different sections for each of the rows for all of our different items. Here we have for item 1001, we've defined, here we've significantly reduced the amount of PHP code within our HTML file. Here we've just defined the current item ID as before, which is 1001. And now for the column where we would output the item link, which is the image and the name link to the items page, we simply have a function call that we echo, and we pass it the current item ID, which is 1001. And as we know from just looking at the function output item link, it can look up the global variable using the global super array and be able to load all of that item's information. And then here we go ahead and output the price and our text box that receives the quantity of items the user desires. Now one thing to note is that the price column changed a little bit because on our previous page, if you look at previous version, because we actually loaded the item from the item catalog within viewcart.php, we actually went ahead and created a short variable called curPrice that represents the current item's price. And so when we went down here to our column for outputting the item's price, we just referenced that short variable. Well, in our new viewcart.php, we don't actually load the item here. We load it within this output item link function. So we actually have to load that price manually here. And so here we're, again, referencing, looking up in item catalog, we're looking up the current item, which has the item ID, cur item ID, and then we're getting the price, the price value out of that array for that particular item, and then we're outputting it. And as you can see, for item 1002, we have the same thing. We've replaced this with output item link. 1003, we replaced the whole section with output item link. So basically, if we go back up to item 1001, here's the start of item 1001. And if we look at the same one on version 10.0, here's the text for outputting, or here's the code in HTML for outputting the link to item 1001. As you can see here, we have a lot of PHP code contained within this first TD tag. Now it's simply replaced with this one function call. So it really neatens up our file and again separates our HTML and PHP, which is good because if we have, for example, developers that work on PHP specifically and developers that usually just work on the HTML portion of the site, it allows the HTML developers to work on the page without having to be sort of involved with the PHP code itself. So the last function that we're going to add to this version is called calc_cart_total. And what that's going to do is it's going to take the calculations that the calculation operations that we did at the top of checkout.php when calculating the shopping cart total and move them out into a function. And again, the reason for this is to remove as much PHP code as we can from our HTML/PHP files that eventually get output to the user. The function is going to be defined in our utility library called utilib.php. And what it's going to do is it's going to access global variables. It's going to access the item catalog that's defined globally in catalog.php, which we include in all of our pages. But it's going to access it differently. As opposed to using the globals super global like we did in output item link to access it, or even using the global keyword, we're actually going to pass the actual item catalog itself into the function, into this calc cart total function. And what that does is it's going to reduce this function's dependency on the global variables. So now basically this function in a way becomes more of a standalone function that can be reused in other spots, because the function will always be able to work in a way because it's always going to have an item catalog passed to it, so it'll always have an item catalog to work with. If we directly access the global item catalog variable from within the function using global, super global, or the global keyword, then we become dependent on the fact that that function is always going to have to work in a PHP web application where that global variable is defined. So this is basically going to improve our function's reusability. So let's go take a look at our old checkout.php page. And if we look at the top section where we calculate the total of our cart, we have a bunch of arithmetic operations here where we've basically multiply each item's price times the quantity the user submitted and cumulatively added up. Then we multiply it times the sales tax rate to basically get our final total, including sales tax, and then round it off. Well, what we can do is remove all of this code right here out into a PHP function that we're creating called cart total, and we're going to reduce this all to a simple function call. So if we look at version 11.0 of checkout.php, whereas we had all of those calculations before, like here, in this section, now it's become a single function call. It's a function called a calc_cart total. It's going to return the total calculated, which we're going to store in the same variable that we had before, current total for current total. Calc_cart total is going to basically take in two parameters. The first one is cart items, and cart items is, if we look at the top, is a get variable that's passed to the form from viewcart.php, and basically it's an associative array that lists the item ID as the key and then the quantity selected by the user as the value of the array. So we're going to pass that that get data onto our function, and then we're also going to pass along item catalog. And because we're in global scope right now, we're not within a function in this script, item catalog is accessible. It's a global variable. It's defined in config.php, and it has global scope. So we have access to it, so we're going to pass that variable directly to the function so that it doesn't need to use the global, super global, or the global keyword in order to look up basically the item's price within the item catalog. So if we go and take a look at utilib.php, and we look at the function we've created called calc_cart total, here you can see basically it's got the same code that we had used before, and we've basically just put it into a function. And what it does is it uses the item catalog that was passed in to the function as opposed to directly access using the global keyword to look up each of the items' prices, and then it multiplies it times the quantity of the item that was selected by the user, which is the value associated with the item's ID, with the key that is the item ID of the item you're interested in cart items, which again, cart items is the get variable that was passed to checkout.php from viewcart.php. So we basically perform the same calculations, cumulatively add up the total. Here we actually do have a little bit of global dependence in that we're actually accessing the sales tax rate constant, which we have defined in config.php. So we go ahead and add the sales tax to the total, and then we return the total rounded to 2 decimal places. So we're essentially performing the same things as before. And as you can see up here, for the global dependencies listed, we have global dependency on the constant sales tax rate, whereas actually if we go ahead and look down at if we go ahead in the other file, if we go ahead and look at output lib.php and look at our output link item link function, there's actually two global dependencies. One is on the constant image dir, and one is basically on requiring that this item catalog global variable be available. So in this new function that we've created, we don't have that dependence any longer, which in general is a good thing. And so here once again is what calc total does. It's going to return the rounded off value, and then when we go and look back at checkout.php, it returns that value into cur total, which we can use throughout the rest of the page to output the total as needed. So for today's homework challenge is typical of our web application lessons. Basically just want to make sure that you understand working with local function scope and global scope, and understanding how within our functions we can access superglobals, constants, and global variables, and the different ways that we do that. Superglobals are always available. Constants are always available without having to use the global keyword. And then any other global variables defined in our main script can be accessed via the global keyword or the global's superglobal. Additionally, just note how for output item link and calc cart total, we essentially are accessing the global variables in different ways. In this one, we're accessing it directly using the global superglobal array, and here we're actually reducing the dependency on the global variable by actually passing the catalog itself into the function, so it has direct access to it without having to use the global superglobals array. The global's superglobal array. The other thing is just to be sure that you understand, for step 3 here, how separating out the PHP code into our 4 different functions, it's going to promote code reuse, because we're basically taking that same, as we saw several times, we're taking similar sections of code and sort of parameterizing it, putting it into one function that we can call over and over. So if there's any problems with that code, we can edit it in one spot. As we'll see, as a web application builds up, that's also a good thing, because then maybe if we change how we want to, for example, process a get variable, we only have to do that in one location as opposed to going through and doing it in every location where we process a get variable. And also understand how doing our functions allow for the separation of PHP and HTML, where we're basically taking large sections of PHP and what are essentially our files that are output to the user. There are .php files that contain a mixture of PHP and HTML. We're taking the PHP out, moving it into a function file, and basically it cleans up our sort of output pages that maybe an HTML developer would work with. So in the end, this ends up making a more flexible and easier to maintain web application. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.